The stagecoach arrived on a Tuesday morning, kicking up a cloud of dust as it rattled down the uneven road. Eleanor May Hartwell stood at the window of the general store, her heart sinking as the horses slowed to a stop. She had waited 3 long years for this moment, spent every last penny her father had left her, hoping this would be the solution to everything. But as the door of the coach creaked open, she saw the man stepping out, and her stomach turned. This wasn't what she'd ordered. Not at all. He was limping, using a walking stick that seemed more a crutch than a support. His clothes were fine, but they couldn't hide the strain in his posture or the scars on his hands, as though they had once been strong, but something had broken them. Eleanor's first thought was that he must have been someone's mistake, perhaps a last-minute substitute, someone the agency had hurriedly sent her way in desperation. The town had warned her about how things were in the frontier, men desperate for a fresh start, and women willing to settle for anything. But this wasn't what she had imagined. Not by a long shot. The station master watched her from the corner of his eye, his pity so thick she could almost feel it weighing down on her. She could hear the whispers from the other townsfolk as they began to gather around. She couldn't stand it. She turned sharply from the window, stepping away from the glass before anyone saw the look of disappointment that she knew would be etched on her face. This wasn't what she'd saved for. This wasn't what she'd planned. She had done everything by the book, consulted with the agency, filled out the proper forms, and waited. She needed a strong man, someone to help her with the farm, someone who could work the land, someone who could carry the weight of her father's debts and turn her crumbling farm into something sustainable. But this man, the one stepping off that stagecoach, wasn't strong in any way she could see. She was supposed to marry someone who could help her stand tall in the eyes of the town, not someone who would make her the subject of whispered gossip. Yet, as he approached her, the man greeted her with a politeness that caught her off guard. His voice was soft, educated, but there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. "I'm James Merrick," he said, extending a hand to her. Eleanor hesitated before shaking it, her fingers brushing against the worn leather of his glove. His grip was firm, but didn't hold the power she had expected from a man sent to help her. His face was worn, like his hands, but there was an intelligence in his eyes, something that made her second-guess her judgment, if only for a moment. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice soft. "It's an honor to meet you." He wasn't what she expected. He wasn't even close. But his demeanor was polite, and for a moment, Eleanor wondered if she might have been too quick to judge. But then the thoughts of the debt, the failing farm, the whispers of the town, the weight of it all came crashing back. Before she could say anything, the station master came up, his hands fidgeting in front of him like he was about to make some sort of announcement. "Miss Hartwell, this is Mr. Merrick," he began. "He's all yours now, as per the contract." Eleanor couldn't help herself. "He's not what I ordered," she said bluntly, before her brain could stop the words. James didn't flinch. He pulled out a bundle of papers, handing them to her. "The contract is binding," he said calmly, his voice steady despite the tension. "There's no clause about being able-bodied." Her eyes flicked to the papers in her hands, and she sighed. This was it, the contract she had signed 3 years ago, the contract that had cost her everything. There was no going back now. "I need a worker," she muttered, not looking at him. "Not someone I need to care for." James's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. "2 weeks," he said. "I'll work for 2 weeks. If I prove worthless, I'll leave. You'll keep the money." Eleanor felt trapped. The town was watching. The stagecoach had already begun to leave, and her reputation hung in the balance. She couldn't back out. "Not now." "Fine," she said, her voice sharp. "But if you fail, I'll make sure no one will ever work with you again." The station master's face tightened, but he said nothing. He knew, just as well as Eleanor did, that her word would carry weight. She couldn't afford to have anyone think she was a fool. The idea of being stuck in this arrangement for the long haul was unbearable, but the alternative, being left with nothing, was worse. So she agreed, and The contract was set. As James climbed into the wagon, Eleanor drove the horse herself, her back stiff and straight, pretending not to notice the way the neighbors stared from their porches. The silence between them was unbearable. She had nothing to say to him, and she certainly didn't want to listen to any more apologies or explanations about his condition. The farm, a reminder of everything she had lost, loomed in the distance. The fence posts were leaning, the barn was falling apart. It was a place that begged for help, a place that had been forgotten by everyone except Eleanor. And now, she had this man with her, a man she didn't want, didn't need. As they neared the house, James's limp became more pronounced, his stick tapping the ground with each step. Eleanor glanced at him from the corner of her eye. He was trying to look normal, to look capable, but she could see the weariness in his movements. She didn't need him to be tired. She needed someone who could work. When they finally reached the front door, James paused. He turned back to the fields with a gaze that wasn't measuring the land, but something else. Something Eleanor didn't understand, something she didn't know if she ever would. But in that moment, she felt the weight of the decision she'd made. It was too late now. She turned away, pushing open the door. What she didn't see was the way his hands trembled as they reached for the doorframe. Not from weakness, but from something else. Fear, maybe, or the exhaustion of a man who had been rejected too many times. And yet, neither of them knew it then. Neither of them knew the journey they were about to start. How everything would change in the weeks to come. How, in 6 weeks, their lives would either be shattered or built up in ways neither of them could have imagined. But that's a story for another time. Let me take you back to where it all began. The first week was nothing short of a disaster. Eleanor had expected the work to be hard. She was no stranger to hard work herself, but she hadn't anticipated how much James struggled with even the most basic tasks. She assigned him the job of mending the broken fence, and as she watched him try to lift heavy posts, his hands trembling on the rough wood, she couldn't help but feel a pang of disappointment. His movements were slow and clumsy, and after several hours, barely a foot of fence had been fixed. She had hoped his mind, at least, would help him compensate for his disabilities, but nothing he did seemed to accomplish what she needed. The same was true for the wood chopping. He swung the axe with awkwardness, his stance unsteady, his grip weak. By noon, Eleanor's frustration grew, and she found herself watching from the kitchen window, torn between vindication and guilt. She didn't want to feel sorry for him, but it was hard not to when he was clearly in pain. By the end of the day, the well wasn't dug, the fences weren't mended, and Eleanor's hopes had begun to fade. But that evening, something unexpected happened. As she walked past the barn, she noticed the barn door that had stuck for months, refusing to close properly. It now swung open and shut with ease. The old water pump, which had always required 2 hands to use, now worked with a clever lever system. Even the feed troughs, which had always been difficult to fill, were positioned in a way that made the task easier. Eleanor stopped, confused. She hadn't asked for any of these things, but it was clear that James had seen problems she hadn't even noticed and fixed them. It was then that she realized he wasn't just a laborer. He was an inventor, a problem solver, someone who saw the world differently than she did. The next day, Eleanor went into town to gather supplies, hoping to forget the strange mix of guilt and relief she felt about James's unexpected solutions. But as she walked into the general store, the judgment was already there. Mrs. Brennan, the busybody neighbor, was full of sympathy, her voice dripping with pity as she muttered, "Such a disappointment, dear. A crippled husband." The other women in the store whispered behind their hands, eyes lingering too long. Eleanor, already on edge, defended her choice weakly, trying to brush off the whispers, but she could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her. By the time she got home, the gossip was already spreading like wildfire. It didn't take long for the whole town to know about James's arrival, and the doubts had already set in. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She heard sounds coming from James's room, late past midnight. A candle flickered under his door, and she thought she heard something, a faint noise, almost like crying. But no, it wasn't crying. It was frustration, the sound of pins scratching on paper. Eleanor almost knocked, but she didn't. She stayed there in the darkness, wondering what he was doing. Was he planning something, working on another one of his inventions? Or was he, like her, battling the loneliness of a life they hadn't expected? That evening, as they sat down to supper, the silence was oppressive. James broke it first, asking a question that stopped Eleanor cold. "Why did you choose a mail-order husband?" he said, his voice soft but insistent. "A woman who can run a farm on her own, you didn't need a worker. You needed something else." Eleanor's hands froze on her plate. He was right. She hadn't needed a worker. She needed respectability, someone to stand by her and make the town stop whispering. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him. But now, looking at this man she had judged so harshly, she realized the truth. She had traded one kind of shame for another. And he knew it. The tension between Eleanor and James lingered, thickening with each passing day. On the 10th morning, as Eleanor watched him attempt to chop firewood again, she couldn't ignore the exhaustion that clouded his every movement. His hands shook as he swung the axe, and the pain on his face was impossible to miss. Finally, he dropped the axe, sitting on a stump, head in his hands. Eleanor stood there for a moment, her heart heavy with frustration and something else, sympathy, perhaps, or guilt. She couldn't tell anymore. She took a deep breath and walked over to him, offering him a tin cup of water. The gesture was simple, but it was the first real kindness she had shown him. James looked up at her, his eyes weary. "I know I'm failing you," he said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know how to explain her disappointment without sounding cruel. So instead, she simply replied, "You're not failing. You're just not what I expected." The words stung even as she spoke them, and she could see a flicker of something in his eyes, perhaps shame or maybe resignation. "The story of my life," he said softly. Eleanor walked away, her heart heavier than before. That evening, something shifted. James, exhausted from a day of struggling with the tasks she'd assigned him, retreated into his room. But this time, he didn't go to bed. Instead, she heard the faint scratch of a pen on paper. The sound was so quiet that Eleanor almost wondered if she imagined it. But she didn't, and curiosity gnawed at her. She almost knocked on the door, but stopped herself. What could she say? What would she even ask him? And then, as the hours passed, she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to him than she had given him credit for. That night, she lay awake, her mind racing with questions. What was James doing in there, alone in the dark? Was he planning some new invention, some clever idea to help her out with the farm? Or was he simply working through his own pain in silence, as he had for so long? It was only the next day, after James had struggled yet again with the day's chores, that Eleanor decided to confront him. She had to know more about the man who had come to her farm with so little hope. As she entered his room, he was sitting at the small desk in the corner, his leather case open in front of him. Eleanor hadn't noticed it before, but it was a simple, worn wooden case bound with leather straps. It looked old, well-traveled, like it had seen a lot of life. The sight of it caught her attention, and for the first time, she wondered what he kept inside. He glanced up at her, his face momentarily caught between surprise and something else. Was it fear? "What's in the case?" Eleanor asked, her voice gentle but firm. James hesitated, then stood up slowly, closing the case carefully as if it contained something fragile, something precious. "It's nothing," he said quickly, but Eleanor could tell by the way he held it that it was far from nothing. She crossed her arms, her brow furrowing. "It doesn't look like nothing," she replied. "What is it?" For a long moment, James seemed to weigh his words. Then, with a deep sigh, he finally spoke. "These are my designs. The things I used to work on before." He trailed off, and Eleanor's heart skipped. Before the accident? She prompted, already knowing the answer. He nodded, his face clouding. I was an engineer for the Silver Creek Mining Company. Designed safety systems, warned them about structural issues that could lead to collapse. They ignored me, ignored the dangers. I told them it was only a matter of time before the mine would come down on us. His voice was tight with emotion as he continued. When the collapse finally happened, I was the one who saved 3 men from the wreckage, but I was the one who got crushed in the process. My leg never healed properly, and the company made sure to blame me. They blacklisted me. No one would hire me after that. No one would believe I had anything left to offer. Eleanor listened, her stomach sinking as he spoke. She hadn't known the full story, hadn't realized how much he'd lost, how far he had fallen. She had assumed he'd been broken by life, by his injury, but now she saw how much more had been taken from him. His career, his pride, his future. So, I ended up here, James said softly, thinking maybe I could start over. A last chance at something. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. She wanted to apologize, to offer some comforting words, but they felt so empty. I'm sorry, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know. I thought. She trailed off, unsure of what she had thought, unsure of how to explain how wrong she had been. James gave a bitter laugh. No one ever knows what someone like me goes through. I used to have a future, a purpose. Now I just try to survive. And even that's not easy. Eleanor felt the weight of his words, the enormity of his past, and it left her speechless for a long moment. But then, something caught her eye, the leather case. He opened it slowly, revealing 5 thick, leather-bound journals. Each one was filled with detailed drawings. Irrigation systems, plow designs, improvements for harvesting tools, each meticulously annotated with measurements, materials, and costs. Eleanor reached for one of the journals, flipping through it with increasing wonder. These are brilliant, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Why aren't you selling them? James let out a bitter laugh, his eyes shadowed with the weight of old wounds. Who listens to a crippled man about engineering? He asked, his voice filled with resignation. What good are these now? But Eleanor saw it, what he couldn't. These weren't just designs. They were solutions, answers to problems that had plagued the farming community for years. They could change everything. She set the journal down carefully, looking at him for the first time without judgment. Someone should listen, she said, her voice firm with a sudden clarity. These designs are worth something, James. You're worth something. His eyes flickered with surprise, then something deeper, hope, maybe, or disbelief. I don't know if I can anymore, he muttered, but Eleanor could see it. A spark, just the faintest glimmer. It was there, and for the first time since he'd arrived, Eleanor felt something stir inside her, a flicker of the future she hadn't even dared to dream of. The morning after their conversation about James's designs, Eleanor woke with a new sense of purpose. She had seen what James could do, seen the potential that was locked inside him, and she couldn't let it go to waste, not when it could save them both. They needed a plan, and fast. The harvest fair was only 5 weeks away, a perfect opportunity to present James's inventions to the right people. She decided to take a gamble, one that would either lift them from the brink of ruin or make everything worse. The first time she brought it up, James was understandably reluctant. I don't know if I'm ready for that, he said, his voice low, the weight of his past hanging heavily in the air. I've spent so long being discarded. People won't take me seriously. Eleanor looked at him, her gaze steady. We don't have a choice, she said. You're brilliant, James. Your designs could change everything, but I can't do it alone. The fair brings manufacturers from all over. I'll tell them your designs are my father's work. I'll present them as my own, and if they buy any of them, we split the earnings 50-50ths. We'll have enough to save the farm, and you'll have a fresh start. James stared at her, hesitant. You're asking me to lie, he said, his voice edged with disbelief. That's deception. She shook her head, not backing down. It's survival. For both of us. If we don't make something happen, I'll lose everything. If we do this, we have a chance to change our lives." He hesitated, the words weighing on him. Finally, after a long silence, he sighed. "If this ruins you, Eleanor, I'll never forgive myself," he said, the vulnerability in his voice striking her. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "It's not about me," she said softly. "It's about us. We'll do this together." The next few weeks were a blur of late nights and hard work. Eleanor threw herself into learning every detail of James's designs, studying them like her life depended on it, which, in a way, it did. James taught her the intricacies of each one, explaining the mechanics with a patience that surprised her. As the days passed, they worked side by side, often in silence, but sometimes sharing quiet conversations over meals or during breaks. The more time they spent together, the more Eleanor realized just how much she enjoyed his company. James, too, seemed to relax, his sharp intelligence shining through as they pieced together their plan. But there was something else, something neither of them was willing to acknowledge. They were beginning to care for each other. Their growing bond wasn't just about the farm, the designs, or the fair, it was about them. Despite the mutual attraction, neither of them voiced their feelings. It was easier, safer, to keep things focused on the work. But the rest of the town was starting to notice the changes. Eleanor had always been an independent woman, but now, with James by her side, people were talking. Mrs. Brennan, who had already made her opinions known, became the town's chief gossip. She watched Eleanor and James late into the night, saw them talking in hushed tones, working together in the dark. Word spread quickly that Eleanor, a respectable woman, was spending more time with a man who wasn't even fit for the work she needed him to do. The whispers grew louder, and by the time Eleanor made her next trip to the general store, the women there didn't even try to hide their judgment. "I heard you've been staying up late with Mr. Merrick," Mrs. Brennan said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension that Eleanor had come to dread. "A man like that, in your house alone? People are talking." Eleanor's stomach turned, but she stood her ground. "It's none of your business," she said, her voice sharp. But the damage was done. The town was already buzzing with gossip, and there was nothing Eleanor could do to stop it. She felt the weight of their eyes on her as she walked back to her wagon, their judgment following her every step. By the time she got home, she could hear the whispers already starting. It wasn't long before men from town began to stop by, making crude jokes, eyeing her with suspicion. At church, the looks were worse. The women gave her cold stares, their whispers louder than ever. Even the shopkeeper hesitated to offer her credit, clearly worried about what the townspeople might say if she continued to defend James. And then, one afternoon, things escalated. James went into town alone to get supplies. And while he was at the store, a group of men saw him and started making jokes about him, about Eleanor, about the situation she was in. One of them, a particularly cruel man, implied that Eleanor had settled for a man who was broken, both in body and spirit. James, usually quiet and reserved, snapped. He turned on the man, his eyes blazing with anger. "You don't know anything about me," James said, his voice low but full of fury. "And you have no right to speak about her." The man sneered and shoved James, knocking him to the ground. James tried to get up, but his walking stick had fallen out of reach. The men laughed, walking away without a second thought. James lay there in the street, humiliated, unable to stand quickly enough to defend himself. When Eleanor found him later, sitting alone in the dirt, her heart broke. The sight of him, broken, defeated, humiliated, was too much to bear. He didn't speak as she helped him up, didn't meet her eyes as they walked back to the farm in silence. That night, James packed his bag. This wasn't some test, some act of defiance. He had made up his mind. He was leaving for good. In the morning, he would be gone before she could stop him. The pain of the day, the judgment of the town, had finally broken him. But what James didn't know was that Eleanor had already received a letter, one that had arrived that very afternoon. A letter from the Harvest Fair Committee, warning her about the fraudulent plans she had been accused of. If she showed up with James's designs, they would expose her in front of everyone. Their plan was shattered, and Eleanor had until morning to make a choice. Let James leave, losing everything, or fight for him and for the future they were building. Eleanor awoke to the sound of creaking floorboards, a noise she quickly realized was James already up, packing his bag. He was trying to leave before she could stop him, trying to slip away without a word, and for a moment, Eleanor considered letting him go. He had been through so much already, and maybe she'd been unfair to ask so much of him. But then she remembered the letter she had received the day before, the letter that threatened to expose everything they had worked for. The Harvest Fair was their last chance, and it was slipping away. She couldn't let him leave now, not when they were so close to something that could change everything. She quickly rose from the bed and hurried to find him. When she entered the kitchen, she saw him standing by the door, his bag packed and ready. He looked up at her, his face grim. "I can't do this anymore, Eleanor. The way the town looks at us, at me, it's too much. I don't belong here. You don't deserve this." His voice was raw, as if each word tore at him. Eleanor's heart twisted in her chest. She stepped forward, reaching for him, but he pulled back. "James, listen to me," she said, her voice trembling with urgency. "I got a letter yesterday from the fair committee. They know about the designs, and they're going to expose us. They say we're frauds, that we're trying to deceive everyone. But we still have a chance to prove them wrong. If you leave now, we lose everything. The farm, the designs, all of it. But if we stay, we can fight this together." James stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in slowly. His face hardened, and for a moment, Eleanor thought he might still walk away. But then he dropped his bag, the decision already made. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, but we'll have to face whatever happens. Together." Just as they were beginning to feel the weight of their decision, a shout rang out from outside. Eleanor rushed to the window and saw smoke rising in the distance. Thick, black smoke, the kind that could only mean one thing: fire. The Brennan farmhouse was burning, and Eleanor's heart clenched at the sight. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat, and James, too, was already moving. His limp was pronounced as he hurried to the door, but he didn't slow down. "We have to help them," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Together, they ran toward the smoke, and when they arrived at the Brennan farm, the scene was chaos. The entire house was engulfed in flames, the roof collapsing in on itself. Mrs. Brennan was screaming, her voice desperate, as she pointed to the second floor. "My children, they're inside. Please help them." Eleanor looked up at the burning building, her stomach twisting with fear. There was no way to get to the children. The stairs had already collapsed, and the fire was spreading too quickly. Men were trying to form a bucket brigade, but it was clear they were too slow. Mr. Brennan was trying to get in, but the flames were too intense. The situation was hopeless. But then Eleanor saw James. He was already moving, his mind working faster than anyone else's. He didn't stop to think about his own safety, didn't hesitate when he saw the danger. "Get the men to the east wall," he shouted, pointing to the side of the house. "We need to collapse it in a controlled way. If we don't, the whole building will come down at once." The men hesitated, confused, unsure of what he meant. "That'll bring the whole house down," one of them shouted. "We'll be trapped." But James was firm. "It's coming down anyway. We need to control how it falls, or those children are dead." Eleanor stood there, stunned, but she didn't question him. She ran to the men and shouted, "He's an engineer. Listen to him." They looked at her for a moment, unsure, but then, with no other options, they moved into position. James gave precise orders, directing the men to strike certain beams to create a controlled collapse. Eleanor worked alongside him, her hands shaking as she followed his instructions. She watched as he gripped the axe with his burned hands, the pain evident on his face, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Every strike of the axe brought the wall closer to breaking, and the men worked in perfect time, guided by James's instructions. Finally, with one last strike, the wall gave way, and a gap appeared in the burning structure. Eleanor saw the children, two small figures in the window, shouting for help. Without thinking, James stepped forward, his walking stick abandoned, as he moved closer to the opening. He signaled to the men, and they rushed forward, pulling the children through the gap. They were safe. The house continued to burn around them, but the children were alive. As they rushed to the safety of the nearby field, James collapsed to his knees, his hands trembling from the effort. The pain in his body had caught up to him, but there was no time to rest. The fire was still raging, and he needed medical attention. Eleanor knelt beside him, her heart pounding. "James, are you okay?" she asked, her voice frantic. He didn't answer, his breath shallow as he collapsed further into her arms. The men who had watched him, once silent in their judgment, were now gathered around, their faces filled with awe. Mrs. Brennan, tears streaming down her face, knelt beside James. "You saved them," she whispered, her voice breaking. "After everything I said, I was wrong. You saved my children." Eleanor held James close, her thoughts racing. The town was watching. They had witnessed the fire, witnessed James's bravery. For the first time, Eleanor realized that the town's judgment was starting to shift, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like the beginning of something else. And as she cradled James's battered body, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. For 3 days, James stayed at the farm, unable to leave because of the severity of his burns and the trauma to his hands. Eleanor cared for him with a tenderness that surprised both of them, offering him meals, washing his hands, helping him sit up when he could barely move. There were moments when she saw the vulnerability in him, the rawness of someone who had been broken not just by the accident, but by years of being forgotten, and those moments left her unsettled. He had always been strong, had always carried the weight of his past without asking for anything in return, but now he was at her mercy, dependent on her in ways neither of them had ever expected. Slowly, though, the town's attitude began to shift. Women, who had once turned their backs on Eleanor, now brought food and medicine, murmuring apologies, while the men, who had laughed at James and mocked him, began tipping their hats in respect. Mrs. Brennan, now a regular visitor, brought her children, who had taken to drawing pictures for James. The children's innocence was a balm, reminding them both that sometimes forgiveness could come from the most unexpected places. Eleanor, too, found herself changed by the experience. And in those quiet hours, when she would sit beside James's bed, reading to him or simply holding his hand, she began to realize something that had been growing inside her. She had never allowed herself to see it before, but now it was undeniable. She had fallen for him. It was not just his mind that had captivated her, nor was it his strength in the face of adversity. It was the way he treated her with respect, the way he treated her as an equal, not as a means to an end. He listened to her, believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. She loved him, but she wasn't sure he felt the same way. He had said so little about his own feelings, and the tenderness he showed her could easily be attributed to the pain and gratitude he felt. And yet, when she caught him looking at her with those quiet, steady eyes, she knew that there was something deeper there, something that, like her own feelings, he was afraid to admit. But the reality of their situation was far from romantic. The harvest fair was only a day away, and with the scandal hanging over their heads, Eleanor couldn't help but feel that this was their last shot. The letter from the fair committee still lingered in her mind. The people who could change everything were now aware of their deception, and the risk of being exposed in front of the entire town loomed large. Despite all the support they had received from the townsfolk, the reality was that Eleanor and James were still on the edge of ruin. There was only one option left: to go to the fair, to present the designs honestly, to reveal James for what he truly was, a brilliant engineer, not the crippled man they all had judged him to be. But in doing so, they risked everything. The lies, the deception, it all could come crashing down in a matter of hours. And yet, as Eleanor sat beside James that evening, watching him slowly regain strength, she knew that this was their moment. She had to ask him. "James," she began, her voice soft, breaking the quiet stillness of the room. "Your hands, can you still draw?" He looked up at her, his eyes tired but still bright with that sharp intelligence. "It's painful," he said slowly, testing the motion of his fingers as if trying to measure the extent of his ability. "But I can. It's slower now, but I can still work." Eleanor took a deep breath. "The harvest fair is tomorrow," she said, the weight of her words hanging in the air. James shook his head, his face clouding. "Eleanor, no. The plan failed. They'll never take me seriously." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "No, James. The plan changed. Tomorrow, I'm going to present your designs. But this time, I'm telling the truth. I'll tell them who you really are. James Merrick, engineer, inventor, hero." His face softened, and for the first time in days, a flicker of hope appeared in his eyes. "They'll never believe me," he whispered. "They'll never believe you." Eleanor shook her head, her voice firm. "The town will vouch for you. Mrs. Brennan's been talking to everyone. You saved her children. That means something. They'll believe in you now." James's brow furrowed as doubt crept into his expression. "And if we fail?" he asked quietly. Eleanor's gaze softened, and she smiled, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "Then we fail honestly. Together." There was silence between them for a moment, but it was a different kind of silence, one filled with understanding, one that carried the weight of their choices. James searched her face, his gaze unwavering. "Why?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why risk everything for me?" Eleanor swallowed hard, feeling the truth spill out before she could stop it. "Because watching you plan that rescue, seeing you think, seeing you fight, not for yourself, but for everyone else, I saw something. I saw a man who wasn't concerned with what he couldn't do. You were thinking about your bad leg or your hands. You were solving problems, doing what you could. That's who you are. That's who I need." James was silent for a moment, the weight of her words settling over him. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand, his touch light but full of emotion. "Eleanor," he said, his voice shaky, "I need to say something before tomorrow." She opened her mouth to speak, but he stopped her, his eyes serious. "I loved you before the fire, before Mrs. Brennan's apology. I loved you when you looked at me with disappointment, and you still gave me a chance. When you brought me water while I was failing. When you listened to my designs like they mattered." Eleanor's throat tightened as she listened to him. "James," she whispered, I don't know what to say." He smiled, though it was faint. "You don't have to say anything. But if we fail tomorrow, if everything we've worked for falls apart, I need you to know something." His gaze locked with hers, and for the first time, Eleanor knew the truth. This was no longer about the fair or the designs. It was about them. "I loved you before I ever knew what you could do for me," he said quietly. "I just never knew how to show it." The morning of the harvest fair dawned, a sharp breeze cutting through the fields as Eleanor and James loaded the wagon with his designs, carefully wrapping the leather-bound journals in cloth to protect them. The weight of what they were about to do pressed heavily on them both, but neither of them spoke of it. Instead, they focused on the task at hand, the wagon creaking beneath the load of their hopes. The fairground was already buzzing when they arrived, farmers and merchants shouting over the noise of horses and wagons. But Eleanor's heart raced faster than the bustle around her. As she guided the wagon toward the designated area for displays, the small crowd that had gathered parted to let them through, eyes lingering on James, whispers flowing like a tide. It was impossible not to feel the judgment, the years of whispered rumors and quiet mockery settling over her shoulders like a heavy cloak. They'd both felt it, the judgment, the looks, the whispers, but today they had come to silence it. They set up a small table near the edge of the fairground, just enough space to showcase the designs, and Eleanor laid out the journals carefully, glancing at James as she did. He was sitting on a small crate, his legs stiff from the wagon ride, but there was a quiet strength about him now, a calm determination that had not been there before. She watched as he absently rubbed his hands, the burn marks still raw, a reminder of how much he had endured. The manufacturers started to filter in, some strolling by with little more than a cursory glance at the displays, others with an eye for new inventions that could help revolutionize farming. Most didn't even give the small, humble display a second look, but Eleanor wasn't deterred. She had been fighting for years to save this farm, and now, with James's designs in front of her, she knew she had to give them the chance they deserved. A few moments passed before one of the manufacturers, a tall, well-dressed man, stopped in front of their table. Eleanor's heart skipped as he examined the journals with a critical eye. He flipped through the pages, pausing at the intricate designs for irrigation systems, plow improvements, and harvesting tools. Then he looked up, his brow raised, his gaze moving to James. "And he drew these?" he asked, his voice skeptical. Eleanor stepped forward, her posture straight, every inch the woman who had fought for respectability. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "James Merrick, engineer. These designs are his." The man eyed James again, this time more closely, as if trying to gauge the validity of the claim. "With those hands?" he asked, motioning to James's burned and scarred skin. James's face remained calm, though there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Perhaps frustration, perhaps exhaustion. But he didn't let it show. "Would you like me to explain the mechanics?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. The man paused for a moment, then nodded, and James launched into an explanation of the irrigation system, detailing the intricate mechanics and the materials necessary to bring it to life. As he spoke, his passion was clear, and despite the skepticism of some in the crowd, it was impossible not to see the brilliance in his words. The more he explained, the more people gathered, their attention shifting from the simple designs on the table to the man behind them, the man whose mind was clearly a well of knowledge and innovation. As the crowd grew, Eleanor felt a sense of hope rising in her chest, but she knew they still had a long way to go. The true test would come when they had to face the fair committee, the ones who had warned her about the fraudulent nature of her plans. She could feel the weight of their judgment hanging over her, as if they were watching, waiting for her to fail. Just as she was beginning to feel the pressure, a well-dressed man pushed his way through the crowd, his eyes scanning the displays. Eleanor's heart skipped again when he stopped in front of their table. "Excuse me," the man said, looking at James. "Are you James Merrick?" James looked up, surprised. "I am," he replied. The man smiled and extended his hand. "Marcus Webb, Western Agricultural Manufacturing." He paused, and then, as if weighing his words carefully, added, "I was here yesterday. Heard about the fire at the Brennan place." James stiffened, and Eleanor felt a flicker of confusion, unsure of where this conversation was going. Webb didn't seem to notice their hesitation, though. "You engineered a controlled structural collapse with 90 seconds notice," he continued. "That's not luck. That's expertise." He pulled out a folded newspaper from his jacket pocket, showing them an article that read, "Hero engineer saves children in blaze, proves his worth beyond injury." James's face softened, though it was impossible to tell if the surprise was due to the recognition or the fact that someone had finally seen him for who he truly was. Webb continued, his voice warm with admiration. "I came back today specifically to meet you. Mrs. Brennan told me you had inventions. May I see them?" Eleanor exchanged a glance with James, her breath catching in her chest. She hadn't expected this. Webb began to carefully flip through the journals, his face intent as he studied each page. The crowd around them had quieted, all eyes on the businessman and the designs. Minutes passed, and finally, Webb looked up, his eyes bright with interest. "These are extraordinary," he said. "The irrigation system alone could change farming in dry territories." I can see a future for these, Mr. Merrick. A big future. James looked at him, almost unable to believe what he was hearing. You buy these? He asked, his voice hoarse. Webb nodded, his expression serious. I want to buy 3 of your designs outright. $400 each. $1, 200 total, he said. Eleanor gasped. It was more money than she had ever dreamed of making. Webb continued, his voice steady. And I want you as a consulting engineer. $50 monthly retainer. You'd work from home. Focus on your designs. We'll handle the manufacturing. Your disability doesn't concern me, Mr. Merrick. Your mind does. That's what I'm buying. He pulled out a contract, a pen in his hand. If you're willing, sign now. I leave on tomorrow's stage. The crowd around them erupted in applause. The townspeople, once so critical of James, were now clapping, congratulating him, and even the men who had mocked him were now shaking his hand. Mrs. Brennan, tears in her eyes, came forward to hug him. You did it, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. You saved us all. James stood there, overwhelmed, looking at Eleanor as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. He had come to this town a broken man, and now, in the span of a few hours, everything had changed. And when he turned back to the table, Eleanor saw it, the quiet moment of triumph they had both been waiting for. With trembling hands, James signed the contract. The crowd cheered, and Eleanor felt the weight of everything they had fought for finally lifting. As Webb handed James the pen, the future was no longer uncertain. It was theirs. But James's eyes never left Eleanor's. He took her hand, his voice soft but firm. Eleanor May Hartwell, he said, I came here as a mail-order husband nobody wanted. But you gave me a chance. You showed me what I could be. And now, I have something I never thought I'd have again. He paused, his gaze locked with hers. Will you marry me? Not by contract, but by choice. Eleanor, her eyes brimming with tears, nodded. I already chose, she whispered, the moment I decided to fight for you. The crowd cheered once more as James signed the contract, and Eleanor held his hand, steady and sure. This was just the beginning.